Hey folks, as you may already know, I had the opportunity to spend the last few weeks with Canon's R5 Mark II. And today we are going to take a closer look at the autofocus and compare it directly to 4 other cameras and also 2 other brands. Let's get started. I'm David, you are watching The Vision, and let's go. If you noticed that you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe and ring the bell, and feel free to check out my Instagram as well. The new Dual Pixel Intelligent AF is a big deal, especially the action priority mode for ball sports, which is super interesting. But since I had the chance to check this out at basketball games in Munich, we are not going to focus on that mode today. If you want to know my opinion on action priority, take a closer look at my videos about the R5 II and R1. Today I want to see how much the autofocus has improved, generally spoken, in the R5 Mark II and how it stacks up against other cameras in terms of detection and tracking. For the human head, the eye detection, I have done side-by-side tests. And let's start with seeing how the R5 Mark II compares to the old R5. In this direct comparison, the first thing that strikes me is how good the R5 from 4 years ago is still today. A lot of autofocus improvements come through firmware updates, but even today I wouldn't complain about the R5's autofocus. But still, the R5 Mark II is, as expected, better in almost every aspect. The R5 Mark II can still detect the head at a distance, not just the body, and it almost never loses track of the subject. The R5 II switches from body to head and from head detection to eyes much faster, even before the old R5 recognizes the head at all. But let's be honest, in practical terms for autofocus accuracy, it doesn't really make a difference whenever the camera tries to focus on body, head, eye or ear or whatever at this distance, because it's all in the same focal plane. Even at 70mm f2.8 you have a depth of field of 30 centimeters at 3 meters distance. The further away you are, the more depth of field you get, and the closer you are, the less. Still, it's super interesting to know how well the autofocus detection works in each camera, because in extreme situations where it's not so clear, these slight improvements and differences can make a big difference, and with smaller depth of fields, faster apertures, it makes a lot more difference. Compared to the slightly newer R6 Mark II, the results are pretty much the same as with the original R5. The R5 Mark II detects the head and eyes at a distance longer and sooner when I come closer to the camera, before the R6 Mark II even switches from body to head. There were a few instances where the R5 Mark II briefly focused on a rear end. And when I covered my face, it briefly forgot that I had a head at all. But as soon as my hands were out of the way, it quickly locked onto my eye again. Overall, there wasn't a huge difference between the R5 and the R6 Mark II in this regards, but the R5 Mark II is better. Next, let's take a closer look of what used to be my autofocus queen, the Sony A7R V. But this only refers to tracking and following subjects, as the A7R V has the disadvantage of a very slow sensor, which can only deliver data a few milliseconds slower than other cameras, causing issues with accuracy during fast movements. However, the A7R V already features Sony's AI coprocessor and newest autofocus algorithm, which is also used in the A9 III, but there with a much faster sensor. When comparing the A7R V to the R5 Mark II, I feel like the Sony performs a bit better at close range with head and eye detection. It's definitely the worthiest competitor to the R5 Mark II so far. Though there were also some hiccups on both sides. At 35mm and greater distances, this Sony camera didn't recognize me at all until I released and repressed the shutter, not me but my friend, realizing there was a person in the frame again after pressing half the shutter. And once again, while the Canon had longer detected the head, the Sony stayed locked on the upper body. However, both cameras did switch from head to eye almost simultaneously. At 70mm, the R5 Mark II also had a couple of small glitches, where it didn't see me until the shutter was released and half pressed again. But at a distance, the R5 Mark II still recognized the head at significantly greater distances from the camera than with the Sony. Interestingly, the A7R V is the first camera in this comparison that doesn't have a 100% focus field coverage and struggles significantly with subjects at the edge of the frame. I will show you the face detection AF area of the Sony sensor here. As soon as I move out of the face detection AF area, you can see the camera starts to hunt back and forth. And even when I return to the area with the face detection AF, the Sony doesn't recover and completely loses track, despite showing eye detection, torso detection and head detection. Instead, it focuses at the close distance and loses me in last seconds. Lastly, let's take a look at a camera that recently surprised me positively in terms of autofocus. The Nikon Z6 III, which was clearly superior to the R6 Mark II in this respect. But let's see how it compares to the newer R5 Mark II with dual pixel intelligent AF. The first thing you notice again is the lower number of autofocus points in the Nikon sensor. 299 is not much, which means that the Nikon almost always shows the autofocus point next to the head or eye during fast movement. And it's really not great that as soon as I'm out of, let's say, this area here, the Z6 III starts hunting again. This means that face detection autofocus area of the Z6 III is even smaller than on the Sony camera before. But at least, even if it's hunting, it manages to keep up despite the hunt and doesn't mess up like the Sony when I got out of the AF face area. In terms of detection, it keeps up at close range and performs better than the Canon at a greater distance, only losing track of me for a fraction of a second while the R5 Mark II briefly gets confused. Once the R5 Mark II locks back onto me, it switches from body to head faster than the Nikon. All through, it still hesitates a few times before deciding. However, it recognizes the eye much earlier, and let's say, Nikon really needs to work on the position and movement of the displayed autofocus points. That's confusing for me. At 70mm, the Nikon struggles, sometimes completely losing track of me even when I'm standing directly close centered in the frame. It generally detects the eyes much later than the R5 Mark II. At a distance, both cameras perform well, switching from face to eye almost simultaneously. However, it's noticeable that the Nikon occasionally hunts even at a distance, but that could also be due to the lens. I use the Tamron lens here. So, for me, after this comparison, when it comes to human body, head and eye detection and tracking, the R5 II is currently the best on the market for me. It's closely followed by the Nikon Z6 III, which performed second best in my opinion, and then the Sony A7R V. But that doesn't mean that the R6 Mark II or the old R5 are bad in terms of autofocus. They are just a little bit worse in a direct comparison. However, I must emphasize that each of these 5 cameras tested here offers extremely good and practically reliable autofocus that differs only in slight nuances. For example, as mentioned before, at f2.8 and 70mm, you already have a 30mm depth of field at 3 meters distance. So it really doesn't matter if the camera focuses on body, head, eye or ear. It becomes important when things get hectic and the camera needs to keep up with fast moving subjects, or when the depth of field is smaller, like with the 135mm f1.8. It becomes much smaller. At 3 meters we are talking about 5 centimeters depth of field then. And wherever the torso, ear, nose, head or eye are in focus makes a significant difference in such cases. In practice, the R5 Mark II has been a dream so far. As I already mentioned after the event in Munich, the autofocus is incredibly sticky for portraits and there's absolutely nothing to complain about. I also had the chance to test it at a school event and a family party, and overall I have nothing negative to say so far. For me, this is currently the best autofocus for peoples. And for sports photographers, the excellent action priority mode is an added bonus, but like I said, there will be a follow-up video to action priority on this channel. Hit the bell if you don't want to miss it. But let's talk about animal autofocus. I recently mentioned that I trust the R6 Mark II more in this regard than Nikon's new Z6 III. So how does the R5 Mark II perform? Overall, I have to say pretty well. A side-by-side comparison isn't feasible for me here, so you will have to trust me based on what I show you with the R5 Mark II. It was pretty cool that the R5 Mark II could even recognize an eye on an incredibly fast-moving and unpredictable animal like a turtle. Okay, not always, sometimes it mistook the tip of the nose for the eye, but given the pattern on the animal, that's understandable. With lions, it occasionally focused on the ear instead of the eye, and sometimes, well, you know what, it focused here instead of the eye. But it was tricky through the fence. I'd love to photograph lions without a fence someday, and I try to go on a safari photo trip in some years. That will be so cool. The raccoon with its banded mask is recognized and tracked really well, even while climbing, and also, the camera does a really good job with the little fox here too, working reliably and efficiently. When shooting animals like fallow deer or roe deer or red deer, the camera has almost no trouble with detecting. Although it did briefly take the rump as an eye here, but aside from that, it works reliably and well. Okay, sometimes it momentarily shows the nose as the eye before finding the eye again. But that's not a big deal in practice. For example, at 400mm and f5.6, this means that at a 20-meter distance, my depth of field is 80 centimeters deep. Wherever the eye, nose or ear are in focus doesn't make a difference here. Not even if I had a 400mm f2.8 lens, it doesn't make a difference. It's 40 centimeters then. But still, it's very good to see how well it works and how efficiently the algorithm is, since we almost instinctively can recognize an eye on an animal simply because we are conditioned to do so and the cameras are learning to do so. What really impressed me was the bird detection in this case. I briefly showed this on Instagram as well. I find it extremely difficult to see the woodpecker against the colors and the tree at first glance. It also could have been just a branch of the tree. But the R5 Mark II had no problem at all with it. It detected the woodpecker seemingly before you could even see it yourself. And then, despite the small size in the frame, it even could identify an eye. With our closest relatives, the monkeys, the camera had almost no issues with the body, head or eye AF. Only once it did mistake a dark spot on the ear for the eye. But you really can't tell that apart clearly in this case. And again, with the depth of field here, it's not a big issue. Otherwise, it performs very well and reliably with monkeys as well. And yes, someone actually had their cigarette filters stolen from their backpack by the monkeys, and one of the monkeys, the little thief, tried to test if they were edible. I hope it realized that they don't taste good as well. In practice, I tested the bird autofocus on swans and worked it well, but unfortunately they weren't in flight. The only bird I managed to catch in flight was this gray heron, and the camera handled it without any problems, although my shutter speed was unfortunately a little too slow for this. A great feature of the R5 Mark II is that all these animal detection features work in video mode as well, even when recording in 8K 60 FPS RAW. The R5C, for example, which is a more video focused camera, still doesn't have any animal detection autofocus in video modes. And the autofocus overall is pretty bad. Something the original R5 had from the beginning was this animal detection video AF. And in this regard, the R5 Mark II is clearly superior even to the R5C. But I will make a separate video on that topic comparing these cameras. Don't forget to hit the bell if you don't want to miss it. For conclusion, I have to say that the autofocus on the R5 Mark II has greatly impressed me. For humans, it's nearly flawless, with Canon sensors offering 100% autofocus coverage and numerous AF points that really shine here, while the new Digic X and the Digic Accelerator provides almost perfect and reliable autofocus. And for animals, there are still occasionally instances of what I will call ear detection, but it's not a big deal. Some say that Sony's A7R V is the best for animal AF. Yeah, and Nikon's Z8 with the dedicated bird AF mode is maybe also excellent for this. However, I hadn't had a chance to test this for myself. But I was very impressed with the R5 II's ability to detect the woodpecker, for instance. I don't think there's anything you could throw at the R5 Mark II that wouldn't be handled well. And that's a nice statement to make. But it's worth noting that none of the other cameras compared today would have major issues either. Even the old R5 already had a very good capable animal AF. And I recently tested the R6 Mark II against the Z6 III. Comparison videos coming soon, and it's far from being bad in terms of autofocus. And the Sony A7R V may not have the fastest sensor, but it offers extremely good detection and tracking and autofocus algorithms that are top notch from Sony. And again, when we are talking about depth of field here, it really doesn't matter wherever the body, head, eye, ear or nose or mouth is in focus in most of the cases. But the action priority mode of the R5 Mark II for ball sports is, in my opinion, a much bigger game changer. And when I finally own my own R5 II, I plan to make another video focused entirely on action priority and testing the different modes for basketball, soccer and volleyball. Until then, I hope you enjoyed the R5 Mark II's autofocus deep dive from me. Let me know what you think about the results. Feel free to leave a comment or drop by the Discord server if you like. And if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell to don't miss any of my videos in my R5 Mark II series. And if you want to support my work, you can do so by purchasing through the links in the video description down below. And here are some more videos that you can watch next from DaVision. And that's it for today, and goodbye, see you next time.